Shalom, y'all, and welcome back to Isaiah. We're going to deal with the third section of Isaiah today, chapters 7 through 12, and I want to give you a little bit of an overview of the whole section before we get started, because remember, the danger with Isaiah is that it's easy to get lost in the trees. So hopefully we'll start with a view of the forest today, and that'll give you a map to find your way through the trees. To just review the big picture, Isaiah 1 through 39 is sometimes called the book of judgment. It deals with God's judgment against everybody. And there's a parallel here to the book of Revelation, which also deals with God's judgment against everybody. Chapters 1 through 12 are focused mainly on Judah, the southern kingdom, and that's what we're in the middle of today, and we'll finish today. The next 10 chapters or so, 13 through 23, are the judgments against the nations. No one escapes God's judgment. Not Israel, not Judah, not the nations. Isaiah is going to make that very plain and clear. And then finally, 24 through 35, you get judgment against the world. So again, no one escapes. It's a very, very clear and plain message. Everyone is deserving of judgment. God is building his case against everyone with detail after detail after detail. And you have to remember that Isaiah is an assembled book. It took the work of Isaiah, someone, a scribe or Isaiah, and assembled it in a certain order to convey a meaning and a purpose. So we're really getting the judgment of God up front here in the first 39 chapters. And then in chapters 36 through 39, you get a hinge passage. You get the Hezekiah narrative passage that sort of acts as a hinge between the first and the second part. And I think that's on purpose. You get the narrative at important times in the book of Isaiah. And then the last chapters, 40 through 66, are the book of comfort. It's more about, okay, what's going to happen after God's judgment? And it's all through Isaiah, we kind of get this bad news, good news thing. But the overall good news is God is faithful, God will always keep his promises, and God will provide. Now, if God keeps his promises, that means God also has to keep his promise to judge. If you have rebelled against God, if you have rejected the covenant, you will be judged. That's just a characteristic of God, cannot be changed. On the other hand, it is also a characteristic of God that he will provide. He will provide for the remnant, and he will provide restoration. And the last 40 through 66 chapters of Isaiah really deal heavily with that restoration to give the people that have been exiled to Babylon, somewhere there in chapters 36 through 39, an idea that God is still with them, even though they're not in Israel. God is still with them, even though the temple is not there, and God will provide for them. So that's sort of the big picture. Now, honing down a little bit, the smaller picture is we've got so far two different vision oracles or judgment oracles at the beginning of Isaiah. And remember, the oracles are sort of the key to the interpretive aspect of Isaiah. If you know the oracle, if you know the genre of the oracle, then you're better equipped to interpret it correctly. So the first 5 chapters of Isaiah is a judgment oracle. It's a judgment against Israel. And God lays that out against them, so there is no doubt they deserve punishment. And I think Isaiah probably, in my opinion, assembled the book with his judgment section first, just so people couldn't argue. Because if you just from personal experience, you know, if you accuse somebody of anything, they can come up with all kinds of justifications. And Isaiah is saying he's laying out God's case, legal case, against Israel. And there is no escape. Israel is doomed. Israel is guilty. So you get that judgment oracle, and we use kind of the judgment oracle rules to interpret that. Second thing, in chapter 6, you get a vision oracle. Now, in vision oracles, you have even more poetry, even more images. This is God's throne room experience. So we saw that as a different kind of genre, a different rule for interpretation, and we interpreted it the same way. And by the way, you see exactly the same thing in the book of Revelation when John goes to God's throne room. Very similar description because they're both describing the same thing. Different reactions. Isaiah is scared to death because he knows he is unclean and from an unclean people. John does not seem to be scared in the book of Revelation. He's looking around, he's taking notes, he's listening to the singing, and I think that's because he has the benefit of forgiveness through Jesus. God sees him as righteous through Jesus. So we get the vision in chapter 6. Now in chapter 7, we get a different kind of narrative, a different kind of genre, and this is a narrative. Now, the others, we were looking for images and wild emotional claims and all kinds of things. In narrative, we're looking for accuracy and historical truth. In the next video, I'm going to give you some historical background, the historical context of what's going on, because unless you understand that, the narrative is not going to make a lot of sense. So we get into chapter 7, talking about the narrative of what's going to happen to Israel and the judgment that is coming. We get the weird sounding names that indicate the different things. Swift is the booty, speedy is the prey, indicating that Assyria is going to come and take over the northern kingdom of Israel. So we're dealing with historical fact here, and we can indeed verify that these things happened at the time they said they were going to happen. So chapter 7, we get this narrative talking about Emmanuel, God is with us. And I think it's important that right after the throne room experience, we get this statement from Isaiah that God is with us, Emmanuel. Now, we see that from a New Testament perspective, but the audience of Isaiah saw that as the immediate fulfillment of a prophecy proving that God was with them. And we'll talk a lot more about this as we go through the week. But that's God's message to them. Who are you going to trust? Trust me because I will provide. Trust me because I am with you. And again, we see exactly the same thing in the first chapter of the book of Revelation. Jesus Christ is among the 7 churches, the 7 churches that are undergoing persecution, that are wondering where God is. Jesus is among the churches. Jesus is Emmanuel. God is there with the churches. So again, just see that parallel there. Chapter 9, we get a description of the Messianic era. Now we're going back and forth in this section between judgment and Messianic era, or kind of judgment and comfort. Remember, God will provide both of those because God is faithful. God has to judge because he said he would, but God also will be merciful to the remnant because he said he would. He is going to provide a Messiah, an anointed one, to rescue and redeem and deliver his people. So chapters 9 is the Messianic era. Second part of chapter 9, judgment against Israel, the northern kingdom. He's saying Assyria is going to come and take you away. There's nothing you can do about it. But then in chapter 10, Assyria will be judged. So there is no escape for anyone. Even though God uses pagans to accomplish his purpose, those pagans are not favored by God necessarily. They will be judged by God just like everyone else. Chapter 11, you get more Messianic era kind of promises. And then in chapter 12, it's a whole chapter devoted to praise. So it's kind of like the big picture. Yes, God is, well, let me start over. Yes, we are guilty. No question about it. Yes, God must judge us because that is his character. Now, after God has judged us, there is a Messiah. There is redemption. And because of that, even in the midst of our exile or today in the midst of our troubles, we can start praising God because we know that he will always provide and he is always there for us. So that's kind of the big picture. We'll spend some more time talking about the individual trees in this section. A lot of interesting stuff going on. But join me in the next video. And until then, shalom, y'all.